Most kind and righteous Father in heaven, we thank you for being with us so far on this Sabbath day, that we're able to be here this beautiful sunny afternoon and to be able to share and to discuss and try to understand a little bit more about what it is that you wrote down all that time ago that is still relevant to us, and what this can mean for us and how it's affecting the world still today. Please be with us now. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Right, so we are now on our series, God has spoken through his prophets. We are looking at our sixth study out of 7. So we're almost home, just 2 more topics to look at. Now, see, we've gone through not too many, that one. Gone through these 5 subjects so far, and today we're going to look at war in heaven and on earth. There's always quite a lot of information to go through, so we'll be going through it at some pace. Some of it is built on stuff that we've looked at previously, so apologies to those who haven't yet seen all of the previous stuff. And then there's just one more topic after this. So we showed this slide last week. I think it was the first time I showed this slide, looking at this idea that there are many ways to cut it, but most scholars will agree that there is a chiastic structure in the book of Revelation. It does follow and swivel around the center point. The exact splits, there can be plenty of ways to interpret it, and I've taken the most simplistic of just putting it into 3 general groups. I've seen ones that go up to around 20 different groups and completely nested into each other. Rather than try to go to that level of detail and get into that many arguments, I figure this one's the safest one to be working through. So we started 3 weeks ago we did the 7 churches. We looked at them when we were looking at the little horn power at the same time. Last week we went through the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, and I think we highlighted the importance of humility and in front of the lack of information. Where we don't know, we can still say we don't know. There are things we can say about it, like where it sits in the chiasm, and we can say it's definitely a historical part. It's definitely something that's already happened. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, we're not waiting for them to suddenly appear in the sky, as many people are, but we are, in fact, recognizing the fact they came a long time ago. But then you have this interesting passage in the middle, which is kind of the end of chapter 11 and then into chapter 14. And then next week we get to look at the last few chapters, looking at what there is still left to happen, and the very, very happy ending we get to at the end of all of this, and what our hope is and what our future is. So that's what we're still looking forward to next week. But this week, before we get to the hope, we still have to look at war. And so there are some very interesting parts we can pull out. Now, there is a very, very curious part of the scripture just at the end here. So at the end of the 7 trumpets, so the end of chapter, kind of in chapter 11, just before you get the transition. So where are we here? So we have the 7th trumpet in verse 15, which is as far as we were reading last week. So Revelation 11, verse 15. The 7th angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The power to rule now belongs to our Lord and his Christ, and he will rule forever and ever." That's Jesus coming again. That's our future. That's our hope. That's what we're still waiting for. And then there's the end of the chapter is an interesting little aside, which has some very, very pertinent points, I think, for us to look at. Because you have the 24 elders. We haven't really looked at who the 24 elders are. I don't think it's one of those things where there's not enough information for us to be able to put a firm answer to, really. But whoever they are, they're in the throne room with God, and they bow down and they worship God, and they say, "We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is, who was, because you used your great power and have begun to rule. The people of the world were angry, but your anger has come. The time has come to judge the dead and to reward your servants, the prophets, and your holy people, and all who respect you, small and great. The time has come to destroy those who destroy the earth." Now, in many ways, this here is a summary of the entire rest of the book of Revelation. there is this piece which we're going to be looking at now where it says the nations are angry. We're going to look at the first part of that today. Just going to be looking at the next couple of chapters of Revelation. This is an action-packed part of the book, and then as soon as that's happened, then you've come to judge, and the reward is there, the punishment is there, and that's the last bits of Revelation after this, describing what's to come. So in some ways, this part here is a kind of an introduction to the second half of the book, and it provides that transition from going through the seven churches, the seven seals, and the seven trumpets, and now moving into something quite different. We're not looking at things in the same kind of patterns of seven and the same historicist view that we looked at previously. Now we're looking at something a little bit different. And then down in verse 19, then God's temple in heaven was opened, the ark that holds the agreement God gave to his people who sinned in his temple. There were flashes of lightning, noises, thunder, an earthquake, and a great hailstorm. So here we have the sanctuary in heaven is open to view. We can see the Ark of the Covenant, where the law is, where God's presence was with his people in the tabernacle and in the temple. That was where the Shekinah glory sat. That was where God physically was in the middle of his people. And it's described as flashes of lightning, noises, thunder, an earthquake, and a great hailstorm. Does that remind anybody of any other times when the law became manifest? Does that sound like anything that you've ever read before? Kind of thunder and lightning and rumblings and earthquakes and that kind of thing? Ten Commandments, Sinai. This is very. John doesn't. He doesn't quote things at all, really. He references things, and this next bit of the work, he's doing a lot of referencing. And here, where we get this image where we're pulling up and where we're remembering when God came down to Sinai and he met with his people. Remember, he's there, and the many voices, the sound of the voice of his voice sounded like many waters, and this huge spectacle as God comes down on top of the mountain, and you have 1 or 2 million Jews, kind of people learning to be Jews on the floor below, and they're all terrified. That was the general thing, and they say to Moses, kind of, please go up a little bit closer. God doesn't shout so loud, terrifying us. You go talk to him, and then you tell us what he said. That way we'll survive. And this is very much what John is pulling on. This is the kind of the level of grandeur that John is referencing here. Now, a lot of this section here, and particularly the rest, we're looking at counterfeits. Now, June, you mentioned this one in Sabbath school this morning, the idea of counterfeits. And this is, there's a kind of a recurrent theme of this through these next sections here of what God has done, and then on the other side, what the enemy is trying to do, what the enemy is trying to persuade us is the right thing, trying to persuade the world, and successfully managing to persuade the vast majority, it seems, of what the way of things are. So we're going to look a lot at this counterfeit, and you start off with the right. So you have a great woman at the beginning of chapter 12. Then a great wonder appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon was under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars was on her head. She was pregnant and cried out with pain because she was about to give birth. So here we have this woman. She was clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, crown of 12 stars. These are all kind of big and shiny and interesting symbols. And we have this vision. This is Rubens painted this one of this part, and looking at that. So many, the Catholic Church preaches that this woman was Mary, literally. And I don't think that's going to be the case. We're going to look at some reasons why that's probably not the case in a second. But this is, we have this scene, and as you read through, you'll see that the enemy is trying to take away this child that she's about to have, and is there waiting, trying to to capture this baby. There must be something important about this baby for this dragon to be trying to capture. I don't know if anybody saw this. I came across this while I was researching. Apparently this was a big thing. There was a sign in Revelation 12. Can you read the date from there? 23rd of September 2017. This has just happened. So there was a lot of preachers have been pushing this idea. Part of it was kind of like as an end-time prophecy, as trying to push towards the end, that when we talk about the woman clothed with the sun, on the 23rd of September 2017, from Jerusalem, this was what you saw. So you have the sun on Virgo, the woman, and the Virgin Woman is the constellation. You have the moon under her feet. Look where the moon is sat, just at her feet there. You had a comet came through her, through the stomach, and then Jupiter coming out of her stomach. Just at this particular point, it's like giving birth to Jupiter. And then above the head, you have the 9 stars of Leo plus the 3 planets, Mercury, Mars, and Venus, all lined up there. 9 plus 3, 12. This is the answer, and there were apparently many preachers doing this. I didn't see this until this week when I was researching for doing this. I was looking for pictures that I could use here, and this was the one that came up. I've never seen that before, but apparently this was a big thing. Everyone's shaking their heads, so nobody else saw it, but apparently it was a big thing. And this actually happened, and there are plenty of people in the kind of evangelical Christian world who are trying to say that this is this is what John was talking about. Was this happening? I personally disagree, and we'll look at what I would believe. See if I can get it to go past the thing here. Right. So let's look at some of these symbols. Woman in white, I would say, represents the people of God. Now, some reasoning behind this. So you have, for example, in Isaiah, for your Maker is your husband. His name is the Lord of hosts. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all the earth. You were like a woman abandoned and distressed in spirit. You were like a wife married young, and then her husband left her, but the Lord called you to be his, says your God. And if you look at those other texts, kind of in your own time, have a look at those. They're all referring to the people of God as like the bride, as the wife, and this is the picture there. So we have this pure woman we can understand as being God's true church, God's true people throughout history. We haven't yet looked at what part of history we're looking at, but we can say that in general terms, this woman is representing God's church. You can see Jill writing them down, so I'll write them down before there you go, right. On to the next one. So there are another example, actually, Song of Solomon. Who is that young woman that shines out like the dawn? She is as pretty as the moon, as bright as the sun, and as wonderful as an armed flying flag. So Solomon using this same kind of the sun and moon symbology. Again, perhaps something that would have sprung to people's mind as they were reading what John had written here. And then you have the sun, moon, and the stars. One possible way to interpret that, looking at the dream that Joseph had, where the sun and the moon and the other 11 stars all bow down to him. Well, if that's the other 11, then he would be the 12th. And so that's kind of the people of Israel. Essentially is kind of all encompassed by that, because that's all of the tribes that there were. Or you can also pull an idea that the moon reflecting the sun's light. So previously you just had a type. You had the law of Moses was saying, kind of trying to explain what was going to happen. And then Jesus came and it actually happened. So you don't need to explain it anymore because it's already happened. And so kind of comparing the sun to the moon in that sense, that's perhaps one way to interpret that. And then another one looking at the idea of 12 stars. So the number 12, it's another one of those numbers that keeps popping up. We mentioned last week the 144,000 being 12 times 12,000. Here again, this same number popping up, and you have the 12 tribes, you have the 12 apostles, you have this number 12 is an important number, and I think maybe completeness, particularly of God's people. It's definitely a sign to them, and 144,000, those saved at the end, definitely to do with God's people and the people who are following God. So I think the sun, moon, and stars, perhaps you can pull them out in that kind of interpretation, I think that's a reasonable way to look at those symbols. And then the red dragon. The red dragon is easy to interpret because verse 9, it tells you who the red dragon is. This is an old serpent, the devil and Satan. So that one's an easy one. And again, a reference, he calls him the old serpent or the old snake, definitely referring back to Genesis, and kind of pulling out that imagery of the Genesis account of the serpent tempting Eve. The dragon is another wonder. So we had the first, there was a wonder in heaven and the woman in white, and then it's another wonder, and this is the dragon. So this is something else, kind of a separate sign popping up. And also reminiscent, there is throughout the Old Testament these ideas of Leviathan, also called Rahab in other places, this mythical monster. And I mean, in Psalm 74, verse 14, you crushed in pieces the heads of the monster Leviathan and gave it to the desert creatures as food. I mean, you look at this creature here, where is he? So verse 3, then another wonder appeared in heaven. There was a giant red dragon with 7 heads and 7 crowns on each head. He also had 10 horns. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and threw them down to the earth. Now, when we're looking here, he says heads. So the Leviathan was a kind of a multi-headed creature. This red dragon has 7 heads. So perhaps we can, again, it's pulling this imagery that we can look at and remembering and helping to understand where he's coming from. So we have this sequence. So the dragon is there waiting for the child. The child is described as a shepherd, is waiting for him to be born. The child was taken up to heaven very quickly after being born. And then the women head in the desert for 1,260 days, which we've looked at, we understand 1,260 years. We've been through this one, and we know that 1,260-year period from 538 to 1798, we've had that number's already come up in a couple of other places, and it's mentioned 3 or 4 times just in these few verses here. And then there's, I'll call it an interlude, and we'll come back to it in a minute, about war in heaven. And then you get back to the story. So the woman is pursued, she flees into the desert for 1,260 years, kind of repeating where we left off. And then the dragon tries to sweep her away with a flood of water. But the earth opens up and swallows the water so that she's still protected. And then the dragon gives up chasing her, and instead of chasing her, goes after her children. So this is the kind of the sequence of events that's happening in this chapter. In Revelation 17:15, there's a particular interpretation of what water means. So this idea of sending waters after her. Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. We've mentioned waters a few times, and waters, I think we can probably put an interpretation, at least in most places, where he's talking about things that are happening with water in prophecy as being peoples. And so there she was in a place full of people with water. It tries to swamp her with water, but she escapes into the desert. So rather than being where the people are, then she's kind of gone to a secluded place. And I think we already mentioned that during the 1260 years, Christianity didn't completely die out, the true Christianity. There were pockets that held it throughout that period. People like the Waldenses, the Huguenots, and many others who lived in, well, the Waldenses lived up in the mountains. They lived in the hills trying to hide away from, I mean, they were in Italy, so they were about as close as you can get to trouble as you can be. But they were hiding away up in the hills of northern Italy and able to hide for a couple of centuries. They were hiding up there before they were eventually rooted out. But then we see Christianity popping up in other places, like the Huguenots in France and other examples around Europe, where the truth was still kept. The Bible was still looked after. There were still pockets of, we refer to as the remnant. That's still kind of carried on throughout history. So coming back to here, tried to sweep away with a flood of water. Kind of the sheer number of people who were believing what the papal system was preaching, this idea of you can only be saved through your works rather than saved by justification, saved by faith. This whole system of the Pope is infallible and that he can change whatever he wants to, and if God said this, but then that was for that time, and now the Pope says something different, so we can change things. That was believed by such a huge part of the world. And then there were other parts of the world as well that were believing similar things under Islam, which was also another form of the same problem, where they were preaching kind of justification by works. And you have to do this. If you pray 5 times a day, you give alms, you do these things. And this is kind of part of the religion that they have. And so during this time, the church was in hiding. We've already looked at that, talking about the 2 witnesses that were that spent that 1260 years. They were witnessing in sackcloth. They weren't able to be out in the open and preaching like we are able today. They were having to hide away. And we have this kind of piece in the middle where we're talking about war in heaven. Let's just read that piece. So it's verse 7 we start. Then there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But the dragon was not strong enough, and he and his angels lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down out of heaven. He is that old snake called the devil or Satan, who tricks the whole world. The dragon with his angels was thrown down to the earth. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "The salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has now come. The accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them day and night before our God, has been thrown down. And our brothers and sisters defeated him by the blood of the Lamb's death. And by the message they preached, they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid of death. So rejoice, you heavens, and all who live there. But it will be terrible for the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, and he is filled with anger." Now this is a kind of an aside. We're looking within the kind of the sequence here. The child, I would say with some certainty we can say that's Jesus. The shepherd, the one who was going to rule Israel with an iron rod. These kind of we're pulling here. This is messianic symbology. So we can say that's Jesus. So the church was there in pain, and then Jesus was born. John here, he's not particularly interested in Jesus as a man. He's more interested in Jesus as God. So we can perhaps skip past the 33 and a half years that Jesus was on the earth, and then he's taken up to heaven. If you want to read what John has to say about Jesus as a man, then he has a whole gospel he wrote on that subject. He doesn't need to cover it again here. Particularly when paper isn't as cheap and easy to come by as it is nowadays, particularly if you're on the island of Patmos. So we have this time looking at Jesus and his time. So after Jesus goes back up, then the enemy makes war on the church. So we start off, and that's part of what we've been looking at with the seven churches, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, looking at the little horn power, this persecution that happened, particularly the initial phases of that, where it was complete persecution and then corruption and then persecution again throughout this dead period of history, this 1260 years. And then we get to the end, try to sweep her away with a flood of water at the end of this. So many people coming against to try and destroy this. Didn't work. The earth swallowed her up. One way to interpret this, because we're looking particularly at the end of the 1260 years, so we're looking at the end of the 18th century. At around that time, Christianity in Europe was looking for a place to hide. And they went from the superpopulous Europe, they crossed the ocean and found themselves in a land with not many people in it, who they very cruelly dealt with and wiped out in large number, but they basically took over, and that's where we have America today. So they hid from the persecuting powers that were here. And that's kind of part of where the American dream comes from, this idea of freedom. And I mean, however much that American dream was never actually true. I mean, the Puritans they wanted to persecute. They were being persecuted by others, so they tried to hide, and they then got to America, and then they were persecuting anyone who didn't agree with what they were saying. So that the American dream is a bit of a lie, but that was kind of, they were able to take a lot of what we consider to be truth, were able to take it across the ocean and hide from the people who were trying to take it away from them in Europe. The kind of the corruption that they were starting to have even then in the Protestant churches. But that didn't work, so make war with the children. So we say we have God's people, and what are the children of God's people? The huge number of churches that there are around the world now. People who all seem to believe completely different things. And you go to one church and it's like, no, our doctrine is the only way, and there is nothing, it's impossible to be saved by other doctrines. And then you go to the church next door and it's like, don't listen to them, our way's the best. And it's like, well, what do I do then? There are churches which aren't so adamant, but there are plenty of churches who are so adamant, and they're very adamant about the ones who aren't adamant, and where do you end up? And this is, I think, perhaps part of the devil trying his hardest to make Christianity worse and fragmenting the churches, making it worse. And you see there's an argument in a church. You've seen it within the Adventist church. There were massive arguments. So in the early 20th century, what was his name? It was Husserl, wasn't it? He came up and he started preaching things and saying, no, I've had new light. I know what God wants us to do. And so the church looked at it and said, I don't think that's light. And so he said, yes, it is. They said, no, it isn't. And he went off and he split off from the church and became what is known as the shepherd's rod, and split off a section of the church. It happens within the Adventist church. Interestingly, the shepherd's rod then split into two, and you end up with the shepherd's rod and the Branch Davidians, who were the ones who ended up getting themselves killed in Waco. And you end up with this kind of splits and splits and splits within, you see it within our church, you see it within most churches around the world. You see these huge divisions between the churches for arguments. A lot of it is stuff that doesn't really matter. And you see it today in a lot of churches where there are massive arguments. Should we have women bishops? And then suddenly a church that has been together for 300-400 years will split and say, no, I can't accept the fact that we need women bishops. And then the other part of the church says, no, we absolutely have to have women bishops. And you end up splitting more and more, and I firmly believe that is the devil working to make it harder and harder for anybody to hear and understand what Christianity is. Because for us on the inside, it looks bad. What does it look like for those on the outside? Everybody on the outside, it's like, okay, well, all of these churches, all of them think they're right. Probably none of them are. And that's the view of most of the rest of the world, looking at us and laughing. And particularly where, ironically, I stand here and I'm trying to say that our way is the right way. Nobody on the outside is going to listen to me, because everybody says that. Even if I do believe that mine is the right way, and I do, but nobody's going to listen anyway. So it all becomes complicated, and I think this is all part of this fulfillment of this part of prophecy. This is talking about the situation we're in today, where Satan is making war with all of the children. Whether they're good children or not, he's making war with all of them. So then we have the war in heaven, and we have this kind of picture, as we just read, in the idea that Satan was thrown down to earth. Something traditionally within the Adventist church, this has been interpreted as an aside and looking at literally the war in heaven. This is when Satan was kicked out of heaven. Before the creation of the earth, soon after the creation of the earth. Timelines are a bit sketchy. Probably before. You couldn't be thrown onto the earth before it was created, really. That becomes a bit complicated. But the idea that Satan rebelled in heaven before creation, I think, I'm not going to stand here and say I'm sure that's the answer. I'm saying that's what I believe, and I'm trying to remember now why I believe it. I'm trying to remember my rationale behind that. It might come to me in a few minutes. But we have this idea of war in heaven, and Michael and his angels kicks out Satan. Most churches put Michael as being like the head of God's army, or something equivalent to that, as he is an angel. I think as Adventists, we've always interpreted Michael as being Jesus. Because the name Michael is who is like God. And we understand Michael as being kind of Jesus before he incarnated as man. He was still something that the angels could recognize. So he, as an angel, not necessarily an angel in race, but something that they could relate to, because God the Father is a bit ethereal to be able to relate to. So no man has seen the Father. So we see Jesus says, and that's kind of perhaps the way of being able to speak to angels is still the same as with us to a certain extent, because even the covering cherubim, they have to hide their eyes to not look at Jesus and their perfect creations, so to not look at the Father. So they're perfect creations, so where does that leave us? So for them to be able to look, they needed Jesus as Michael. Again, there's not enough time to go into too much detail and give all of the reasons why, but that's certainly the traditional Adventist view of that, and I'm quite happy with it. I haven't had an argument good enough to discourage me from that belief, but it's not one that I think is particularly important. It certainly doesn't make that much of a difference to this part of the story, at least. So we have these symbols, and like I said, the woman in white, God's people, the true church. The red dragon is Satan, the baby is Jesus, and then the women's children, the churches of the Reformation, and the sundry divisions thereof over the last few centuries. And then starts the next part of the prophecy. So chapter 13, we start a new bit. Now going back, remembering what we studied when we were looking at Daniel chapter 7, these idea of beasts, and coming up, and they are world powers. Here we're going to see, kind of as soon as you open this and you start reading, I saw a beast, and immediately you're thinking back to Daniel 7 and remembering pieces of that. And particularly there is more specific points looking at Daniel 7, which we'll come to in a second. So I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. Actually, let's look at that beast here. So, chapter 13. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, and there was a crown on each horn. A name against God, or a blasphemous name, was written on each head. This beast looked like a leopard, and had with feet like bear's feet, and a mouth like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave the beast all his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast looked as if he had been killed by a wound, but this death wound was healed. Then the whole world was amazed and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he had given his power to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?" So who is like the beast? We just met an angel whose name is Who is like God. And here we are, who is like the beast? To contrast Michael and what we're seeing here. This beast, very, very similar, still 7 heads and 10 horns, very similar to the dragon. But this is not the dragon, because the dragon gave his power to this beast. So this beast's power comes from the dragon. So this isn't Satan. So the previous one we were looking at, that was Satan. This one isn't Satan, this is something else. I think when we're looking down at the next few verses, we'll see kind of where that comes from. So verse 5, the beast was allowed to say proud words and words against God, and it was allowed to use its power for 42 months. Now 42 months, we've seen that before. Same as the 3.5 years, same as the 1260 days. That number just keeps coming up again and again and again. So immediately that gives us a hint as to what this power is. It used its mouth to speak against God and against God's name and against the place where God lives, and against all who live in heaven. It was given power to make war against God's holy people and to defeat them. It was given power over every tribe, people, language, and nation, and all who live on the earth will worship the beast, all since the beginning of the world, whose names are not written in the Lamb's book of life. The Lamb is the one who was killed. So here we have a beast. Everybody worships him. Everybody except those whose names are written in the book. So you have kind of the impression, the way that's written, that's not written like a lot of people did that. You can tell because if you look at the book, those who weren't in the book were the ones who were there. It says everybody was there, except those ones who were in the book. So you get the impression kind of scale. It's everyone believed except those who were written in the book. There was only a few who were written in the book. It's kind of the way that's written, to me at least, that's how you're going to have to read that. There's an imbalance. There are far more who seem to be worshipping the beast than those whose name is written in the book. Hopefully we'll come and try and work out what these are in a second. Because then in verse 11 he says, then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. Where did the first beast come from? the sea, whereas this one comes up out of the earth. I think we've already looked at the difference between the sea and the earth. So the first one comes out very populous. This one comes up out of the earth, just like what we were looking at, talking about the earth and swallowing up. And I think we're following the same symbology again here. We've mentioned John and Daniel. They repeat themselves. They repeat each other. We have the same things reiterated to strengthen and to improve the point and to give more detail, to give more emphasis, to look at it in a different angle. And here I think we're seeing again this same idea. So we're looking at the first beast here, looking at the papal power, and particularly the civil part of that, because this second beast is very much a civil power. It's coming up at around the end of the 18th century. That's where we see this fitting into the timeline. I'm trying to remember what my next thing. Do you remember these pictures from when we looked at Daniel 7? So Daniel 7, he looked at the beasts. He had 4 beasts. The first 3 of which were, it was the lion, then it was the bear, then it was the leopard. Now, when John is describing this beast, he says, oh, there was this beast, and it looks like a leopard and a bear and a lion. So Daniel, when he's saying this, is like, oh, looking forward, there's a lion, Babylon, then there's a bear, Medo-Persia, and then there's a leopard, Greece. And now John is looking from the other side and saying, this new beast, it has, a bit of it is a bit like Greece, and then a bit of it is a bit like Medo-Persia, and a bit of it is a bit like Babylon. I think if nothing else, that helps to, just the order in which they write that, that's one extra little piece of evidence to help to support the historicist view, to be able to say that this is how we can interpret, because it's the same symbols, just in the other direction. Because John is now after Greece, he's in the Roman times. So he's been through, the world's already been through the lion and the bear and the leopard, and now he's able to look back, but he's looking back kind of the other way and seeing on the other side, which I think is an interesting point. And then this last beast, it's a lamb. I saw another beast rising up out of the earth, verse 11, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. The best picture of a dragon I could find, that's Disneyland, so it's it's not exactly the scariest dragon that there ever was, I think, but it was the only one I could find that was free for use, had no licensing on it, so it was the best free one I could find. So it looks like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. So I think if we're trying to take this as a symbol, looking at this idea of the United States, the United States for most of its history has definitely looked like a lamb. Been there talking about kind of champions of democracy, champions of freedom of religion, champions of so many things that are good. They have this constitution, they're free from any evils that there might be with monarchy. In the UK, we are blessed with our monarchy to have a good monarchy. In many places, not so lucky. The US never had such a problem because it was established as a republic. So I mean, they haven't suffered so many other places have had where you have bad monarchs, and then you end up in a terrible position as a country. The Americans don't have that issue. So many other things that we can say. I mean, the kind of the commercial aspect, the prosperity of the place. I mean, the American dream, it's a lie even more so today than it ever has been, but the American dream of anybody can be rich, anybody can be president. I mean, all of these things, you can be whatever you want, you can become whatever type of person you want to be. There's gold in them there hills, and all of these things, that's, for me, part of the lamb-like nature of America. But it speaks like a dragon. And we see that. They're dropping atomic bombs on Japan. That's a little bit dragon-like, I think. I'd say that's speaking like a dragon. Trump, almost everything that comes out of his mouth seems to be speaking like a dragon. He doesn't say nice things. Even when he's trying to pay somebody a compliment, it somehow comes out not. It's kind of scary the way he talks. And I think that's kind of indicative of the way the US is going, because the US voted in Trump. And there's a reason for that. He wasn't voted in by accident. He was voted in because people like him, because people believe that he is the solution to their problems. And when you have these huge disaffected parts of America, I mean, we think of America, the American culture that we see is New York and Los Angeles, San Francisco. That's what we see. That's a tiny fraction of who America is. Kind of these huge, massive expanse in the middle there, full of people who are losing their jobs, who are not liberal, who are not there marching for gay rights, as we see that people are in New York or San Francisco or places like that. They're doing the exact opposite. And that's a huge numbers of Americans live in that middle part, which are the ones who are all voting for people like Trump. And it's, even if Trump does get impeached, which I can't, it has to be a matter of time. Otherwise, there is no justice in the world. But that's the thing. There is there justice in the world? Can we count on that? It becomes, the longer it goes on, the more it seems to be that it might not actually eventually happen. But even if that does happen, who's going to take his place? Have another election, and then somebody else will stand up and be doing the same things. For the country to be there and have somebody this week retweeting white supremacist Britain First tweets, kind of very fake news that he's retweeting this week that's not what it was actually purporting to be, and he's the leader of the free world. It's scary. So for me, the idea of the lamb looking like a dragon, that for me is ever more close. And the Adventist pioneers, I mean, we were talking last time about Uriah Smith as being the first one who sat down and did a kind of a systematic, try to map out what Daniel and Revelation mean. And he wrote the two books, the Thoughts on Daniel, Thoughts on Revelation, and they were the Adventist textbooks for 50 years before anybody tried to question them, just because they were so well done. Certainly with what he had available to him, they were fantastic books. Even at that time, the late 1800s, before America started to even think about speaking like a dragon, in those times, America didn't step foot out of America. They kept themselves to themselves. They were still preaching this, preaching to themselves, and they were still very, very lamb-like at that stage. And yet at that stage, Adventists were preaching that it's the lamb-like beast is America. So they've been preaching this for 120, 30, 40 years at least, that this has been preached by the Adventist Church, and we're the ones who get to see it happening as things seem to be heading in that direction. Obviously, they've seemed to be heading in that direction before and then gone back. Whether this is the time or not, we don't know. But we can only wait and see and pray that we survive whatever it is. What's the next slide? So, I mean, here we have the two examples sat there in the Oval Office. Barack Obama, somebody who definitely, he spoke like a lamb, whether you agree with his policies, whether you agree with what he actually did, but he certainly appeared lamb-like. Whether underneath he was or not, it's up to you. The other one, he appears to be more like a dragon, right from the word go. And the last part of this section here, so we'll read a little bit further on. So it had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. And this beast stands before the first beast and uses the same power the first beast has. In fact, I forgot to mention, we talked about the wound that was healed. We've discussed previously this idea that where the Catholic Church was, General Berthier marched into the Vatican and he took the Pope prisoner in 1798. He removed the power that the Pope had. And then it was 1929, I'm thinking, when Mussolini gave them back their power, and they had civil power again. I mean, after the Pope was taken away to France, they voted in another one almost straight away, but he had no power. He was a pope, but he had no power. In 1929, that was reinstated, so this idea of this wound that was healed, and everyone marveled after them. I mean, look at the way the world looks at the Catholic Church today. Compare that to how that was 100 years ago, where kind of Catholics were ran out of town, and it used to be illegal in this country for the Prime Minister couldn't be Catholic, the royal family can't be Catholic. I know those rules have been relaxed now, but there was a time when it's such a big thing. So something I never really knew about down south was this rivalry. Up here, you see that rivalry so rigidly. I mean, Rangers and Celtic, that's not football, that's religion. It's Protestants against Catholics, and it's such a strong thing. And then obviously, like the time of troubles in Northern Ireland, and goodness knows what's going to happen if we have to put a border up. And now that the UK is leaving the European Union, if we have to try and put walls back again in Northern Ireland, how much of a mess that's going to make to the progress that was happening, I've no idea. But at the moment, the way the world looks at the Catholic Church, when you see the much-loved John Paul II, everybody loved him. He was a good man. He did so many wonderful things. He was such a nice person. Benedict, kind of a mixed thing, but he wasn't there for very long. And now we look at the Pope now. For the most part, a really nice man, humble. He doesn't want to sit on the big gold throne. He wants to be the humble guy, doesn't believe in all his excesses. And the way that the world reacts to the Catholic Church today is very different to the way they did 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Everyone's kind of back in, the Catholic Church is back in favour with the general public, which wasn't the case. They were kind of decried as papists, and Protestants were very much banging the fist on that. But the wound that was healed, perhaps another way to look at the wound was healed, the Reformation, where the church split off, and you have Luther and so many others like them, but the masses of Christians split off from the church. Countries split off from the Pope. And now you look at them, and I can't remember who it was. It was Stephen, wasn't it? It mentioned about the Lutherans had signed a thing, and that I had a look at that. It's true. They signed a thing to say the Reformation is over. There's a big document that they've written. It's on the Lutheran website. You can have a look at it, and they're saying, no, our differences have been reconciled. We've sat down, and there have been concessions on both sides, and we're now friends again. And it's not just the Lutherans who've done it. There are others who have signed up to this same agreement that there is between the Catholics and the Lutherans. It's Church of England has signed up as well. So I mean, it's an interesting time to look at the kind of this healing process that's happened. That's, I think, perhaps another way to look at this same part of prophecy. But then, I say there was the next bit I wanted to look at. The beast stands before the first beast and uses the same power that the first beast has, or uses all the authority of the first beast. So this first beast, the papal system, is giving its authority to the Americans, which seems a bit odd. I mean, when Reagan and the Pope kind of got together, and particularly when they mentioned a New World Order, that scared a lot of Adventists, and there was a lot of preachers going around saying this is the end, and this is exactly what this prophecy is talking about. But we have this idea that the papal system, the Americans are going to use the power that the papal church had. In many ways, I believe they already do, because the papal church had so much influence around the world. The Americans don't have influence. They have huge influence around the world. America says something, everybody jumps. It's such a big thing. It's like, oh, you don't like that? Oh, let's come on a friendly visit and park our aircraft carrier next to your capital city, and then it's like, yes, sir. This massive shows of force, and they're able to do these kind of things. They have such huge influence, and I think that's perhaps part of using this power of the first beast. But what does it do with this power? By this power, it makes everyone living on earth worship the first beast who had the death wound that was healed. And the second beast does great miracles, so that even makes fire come down from heaven while people are watching. It fools those who live on the earth by the miracles it has been given power to do. And it does these miracles to serve the first beast. The second beast orders people to make an idol to honor the first beast, the one that was wounded by the deadly sword, but sprang to life again. Well, this is one that's been interpreted. Interpreted. We talk about the image of the beast, the idol of the beast. It's not the beast. So it's making people worship the image of the beast, something that looks like the first beast. It's not the first beast, it's just an idol of it, but it looks like the first beast. The way this is, I've always had this preached in Adventist churches. That's a lot of Protestant Christians in the US. They're sounding more and more Catholic in the way they're talking about, not the Catholic Church of today, but the Catholic Church of like 400 years ago. In terms of, we have to do this, we need to make laws so that these things happen, and we must ban this and do this, and God hates fags, and things like that, where they're preaching in this way. That's very different from the God that I know. But that's what they're preaching, and that's much more the way that the Catholic Church would have preached 400 years ago, this kind of absolute totalitarian religion. And yet you look at the southern states, the Bible Belt, and that's what's being preached by so many of these conservative Christians, these very same people who are the ones who have voted Trump into power. This is the huge power base in the US. For me, this is this image of the beast, this distorted Protestantism. I think that, for me, is the image of the beast. That's how I understand it. So pushing this idea of, it's not the beast. Look, it's Protestant, but it's exactly the same thing. And it's preaching exactly the same way. And it's scary. And it fools everybody. It can even call fire to come down from heaven, whether you take that literally or not. If you take that literally, atomic bombs, that kind of works. If you take it figuratively, then it's perhaps a little bit differently. But in the second beast was given power to give life to the idol of the first one, so the idol could speak. And I think that kind of still fits into what I was saying. And the second beast was given power to command all who will not worship the image of the beast to be killed. The second beast also forced all, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to have a mark on their right hand and on their forehead. So no one could buy or sell without this mark, which is the name of the beast, or the number of its name. This takes wisdom. Let the one who has understanding find the meaning of the number, which is the number of a person. Its number is 666. Or apparently there are some texts that say 616. But 666 is the one that everybody knows as the mark of the beast. Now, this idea of the mark of the beast, when these things first came out, barcodes, it's the mark of the beast. We cannot be involved with anything that has barcode on it. We will be caught. Also, you can't buy and sell if you don't have a barcode. And this was the idea of what the mark of the beast is. Those people don't eat much nowadays, as everything has a barcode on it. The fruit comes with a barcode on it. The eggs have barcodes printed on them. Some of them, when you buy them, they've already got the barcode on them. But there are so many other ways that you can look at what this number means. I mean, I know people who try and pull something out of these symbols, like the all-seeing eye and these kind of Egyptian symbols that have no good reason to be on the $1 bill, but they're there. It's kind of all this Masonic symbology, perhaps, and is that what it is? Is that the mark of the beast? I don't think it has anything to do with that. Because if you go back to Revelation 7, so just before we looked at the 144,000, there is this verse where he said to them, "Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we place a seal upon the foreheads of the people who serve our God." So first off, there is a sealing of God's people, and then here in Revelation 13, we see a sealing of everyone else. Everybody gets a seal. So you either get the mark of the seal of God, or you get the mark of the beast. You'll get one of the two. Okay? So am I looking for a guy with a rubber stamp that I need to avoid? What do we mean when we say a seal? Perhaps part of this at the end of the previous chapter. The dragon was very angry at the woman. He went off to make war against all her other children, which we've already mentioned. But he describes those children as those who obey God's commands and have the message that Jesus taught, or have the testimony of Jesus. Perhaps this is what we mean when we're talking about mark and talking about seal. What is it that differentiates these people? Because when we say foreheads, I don't think we're not talking about somebody tattooing something on your forehead or putting something on your hand. The number of times I get forwarded, so many years now, of the Mondex chip that has 666 in it, and it's a little rice-sized chip that you get put in your hand, and you can scan. And I remember being sent that in like the year 2001, kind of like a year after I got an email account. Somebody's sending me something talking about this, and it's the mark of the beast, and we have to be very, very careful because all governments are going to implement it. Here we are, kind of 15-something years later, and it hasn't happened, and I still keep getting the same emails as people still believing this tripe, trying to believe that it's a physical thing in your hand. It's not a physical thing. We're talking in spiritual terms here. You're not going to be able to go along the streets, and it's not going to be like in Germany in the 1930s or something like, where you can walk along the street and you can work out who's got the Star of David sewn on their clothes or not. Just like, well, he's one of them, he's not. He's one of them, he's not. It's not going to be that easy. You're going to be able to physically just see something. We talk about the forehead. That's our thoughts. Our hand, that's what we do. So in our thoughts and our actions, who we are as people, who we are as Christians, that's going to define, I think, whether we have the seal of God or whether we have the mark of the beast. It's not a physical thing, it's who we are as people. So when we say we receive the mark of God, because we accept that Jesus is our Savior, we accept that we cannot be justified by anything we do. We cannot work our way into heaven. And then in thankfulness for what God has done for us, what Jesus has done for us, we recognize that he has a pattern for our lives, and he has something that he wants for us so that we can be truly free, so that we can live long and happy lives and be with him in heaven, because he wants us to live in a certain way. And it's not just a selfish way looking out for ourselves. And then, so what is the opposite of that? The opposite of that is something that very much goes against what God has to say.
Sorry.
Yes.
If that's the case, am I picking up right? Are you saying that the mark of the beast is more spiritual?
Yes, very much.
So how do they control the buying and selling aspect? I mean, there must be surely something physical.
Kind of. I think I'm trying to remember the order of my slides and how quickly I'm going to get to that. So we have, I think, the counterfeit of the true. So I mentioned this side of counterfeit. So we have, on one side we have the mark, the seal of God, and then we have the mark of the beast. And this is going to be the differentiator between everybody at the end. I don't believe that anybody has any seals or marks today. Nobody is. It's not. This hasn't happened yet. But this is something that will happen, where by the time we get to the end, everybody will be in one of these two camps. At the moment, you still have time to make up your mind. You can work out which one you want to be. That's not going to be the way always. There is going to be a time where you have to have made your decision. Right, it wasn't that one. Okay. So, this idea of counterfeits, and I think looking particularly at that. So, what is it that the beast preaches? What was the kind of the central message of the beast? When we looked at it as the little horned power, what was it the little horned power did? He changed times and laws. He spoke against God. So talk about changing times and laws, where you're able to say that this is not, God said that, but that was like 2,500 years ago. Here's what we need to be following today. When we have that, then we can say, okay, so you're changing something that God said, and they're contradictory to each other. So, for example, and this is particularly the way that the Adventist churches preach this traditionally, you look at the Sabbath, the fourth commandment. So where we have, on the one hand, God said, remember the Sabbath day. And then today, the vast majority of Christianity completely forgets it. Where God, at creation, he blessed the seventh day, but everybody celebrates a different day anyway, even though the blessing was on a specific day. Now, we say that the Pope was the one who changed that, and I believe I mentioned at the time, there is no doubt that the Catholic Church changed things from Saturday to Sunday. They are quite happy to say, yes, we did that on our authority. This is proof of our authority. The fact that all of these Protestants do the same thing, that's proof that they're still part of us. They're still on our authority. And there are, I can find the sources for those. I can maybe show you a quote next week of where they say that. But if they say that, yes, of course, that's, she mentions it, Ellen White mentions it in The Great Controversy, this idea. So if we have an example of certainly part of the seal, if not the complete seal, that those who keep the Sabbath compared to those who don't. Now, there have been in the past what are referred to as blue laws, which basically forbid you to work on Sundays. And for us, like for me, if I want to do something, I need to do it on a Sunday, because Monday to Friday I'm in work, and then Saturday I'm here, and I'm not going to do anything secular on Sabbath. So if I need to do something on Sundays, and if I can't because everything's closed, I can't buy and sell. I mean, that's a very innocuous way of looking at it. There's no real kind of persecution in that sense, and particularly where in the 21st century, where I can, if I need to go to the shops, I don't actually have to go to the shops. I have an Amazon Prime membership, so things arrive on my door magically. I press a button, and then tomorrow morning there's something on my doorstep. But there are ways and means of controlling based on what you do and who you are. So, for example, if I refuse to work on Sabbath, but the law says I have to work on Sabbath, then I have a problem. And
You're talking with such a large number of people. There must be somebody to keep note, to check up. If
it is very, very easy to do that, and I think I don't think a database of that is necessarily the mark of the beast in itself. It's not the database we have to worry about. It's the law that implements this, and the thought patterns that go behind this to try and force people to go against what God has asked. And that's, I think, the problem. Today, we are able to keep God's law in free conscience in this country. So in this country, I don't have to work on Friday. I am very blessed to have a job where I finish work at 12:30 on a Friday. So even when in Scotland you get sunset at 3:30, I don't have to worry about that in the middle of winter, because I finish at 12:30. I'm very blessed in that sense. My previous job, I had special permission where I had to leave early and then make up the time during the rest of the week, but they were flexible on that, and I was very, very blessed. Not everybody is going to be so blessed. Yes? Right.
I don't remember exactly when, but at some point relatively recently, 7 they came 6. Guess which one they knocked out? Religious. So just to put this in context, if a job comes up, which I never be qualified to do, and we're under some other situation, like as is still the case in America, I want to apply, and I don't want to be compromised as a Sabbath-keeping Adventist. What they can now do, what they do here again, they will put on the E for essential, you must be available weekends and whatever. And so if you then protest, I'm available for one part of the weekend, but another, the law will say, well, you have no right to apply for this job, because it stated very clearly at the outset that if you were not available for the entirety of the weekends, then you should not apply.
Yeah.
So I have certainly financially suffered from taking a non-liberal approach to Sabbath,
Yeah.
and that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So all you do is just imagine that was closing down in more and more sectors,
Yeah.
where you have to work on Sabbath.
But perhaps I can give another example as well, which I think very much kind of related to this, of persecution by standing up for what you believe in this country. So there's kind of ones that have made the headlines of Christian cake bakers who've refused to make cakes for gay marriages, and that's, I mean, it's their belief, and so they're person, I believe they're allowed to believe that, and they're allowed to stand up for their belief. And if they say it would compromise my religion to bake a cake for you, but they can be sued and they can be found guilty because of this. So that's a very practical example that does happen and is headline worthy, where standing up for what you believe can get you into trouble. And I think the point of this here is that people will stand up for what they believe, and they will get into trouble because of that. The exact mechanism of it, I think we've mentioned this a couple of times before. we don't know. It's very easy to look to, when you were looking to the future on prophecy, we have to be very, very careful to not limit our view too much. Because otherwise we end up in the same position as the Jews did at Jesus' time. When Jesus showed up, it's like, hi guys, I'm the Messiah. And it's like, no, you're not. The Messiah looks like this. You're not him. We're still waiting for him. You go over there. And that was the reaction they had to Jesus. They completely missed the fact he was the Messiah. It was because they had taken such a limited view of what they thought the prophecies meant. So for us, we can say there will be, in my mind certainly, there will be persecution because of standing up for your rights. And this is not just an occasional thing. This is going to be wide scale. This is going to be a massive thing. Starting in the US, will be certainly the ones who will begin that, and it'll be their particular view of Christianity. Perhaps something relevant to that, when you're looking at the question of Sabbath, and in the US, the conservative Christians in the South are spending huge amounts of money lobbying that Sunday should be put apart as a holy day. That Sunday there should be laws. There used to be laws. They were all repealed. Now they want them back again. They want all these laws to say that Sunday you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. You have to keep Sunday as a holy day. Now, if that comes into force, that's a problem for, well, Jews, Muslims, and Adventists. And probably a few others as well, but those are the three that roll off the top of my tongue as we're talking. So that's a problem for us. So I think that's something we can look onto. Today's topic was called War in Heaven and on Earth. I can't argue that there is war coming. There has been war in heaven, but the thing we can learn from the war in heaven, God is stronger than the enemy. And that's where our thing has come. So there is war coming, and I think next week there is a bit more detail on some of this when we're looking at what the final times look like. There's a little bit more detail, not a huge amount, but a little bit more detail we'll look at next week. And then we get to look at the really good bits. We get to see the second coming, we get to see Jesus coming back in the clouds, and the bits we can't wait for. So that's basically all I had to say today. Yes, you may ask more questions. Yes.
About in Revelation's Babylon, who they're actually referring to, because there's all these different stories going around it. It's Islam, it's the Vatican, it's America.
Yes. Yeah, that was one thing I'd kind of been hoping to talk about maybe, but I was spent a bit longer on other things today. This idea of Babylon. My opinion of Babylon is the confused Christianity, the distorted Christianity in general. So this is a wide thing. This is not a specific. It's no. I would say that pretty much all of the vast majority of Protestant Christianity falls into that. I would say the Catholics fall into that. I would say Islam probably falls into that as well, as do many other world religions. And talking about Babylon is confusion. That's what the name Babylon means, coming from Babel. When God came down, he confused the languages. Babylon is confusion, and I think confusion in religion is something I think pretty much most people can agree with, and we see that around the world. So this idea of confusion. Ultimately, the Bible describes two groups, those who have the mark of the beast and those who have the seal of God. So today, we have this proliferation of religions around the world. Ultimately, there will be two groups. There will be those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus, and there will be those who will receive the mark of the beast. And you notice the difference as well in the two. So this is those who receive the seal of God receive it in the forehead. Those who receive the mark of the beast, it's the forehead and the right hand. So they're not just going to receive it and sit down nicely, they're going to go and do something about it. And that's probably bad news for those who have the seal of God. And that, I think, is the end time tribulations. We'll see a little bit more of that in Revelation 17 next week, before we get on to the really good stuff. But that's, hopefully that answers it. It's a bigger... No, I mean, I think we mentioned before that this subject, I think I said it on the first day, this subject is something you can dive so far into. There is so much to read, there is so much to study to try and understand what this means. And I said right from day one, this is a high-level fly-through of what prophecy has to say. In 7 hours to be able to do the entire of Daniel and Revelation, that was always ambitious. Not doing the entire of Daniel and Revelation, I'm not doing any justice to most of what's being talked about, but hopefully giving you enough of a taster to be able to make a decision on whether you believe that God has something to say for us today, whether he has something to say for your own life, and if based on that there is something for you to change, something for you to move forward with, then amen. Shall we have a prayer to close? Most kind and righteous Father in heaven, we thank you for this message, and we thank you for the hope that there is here. We know that there is so much conflict, that the nations are angry, as we read at the end of chapter 11, that there is so much going on around us, and we understand from Scripture that it's going to get worse before it gets better. But that getting better part, we can rest in absolute certainty. We were looking at this morning the knowledge that you've gone to prepare a place for us, that you are coming back for us. That is our hope, that is our joy, knowing that you came, you died for us, you have saved us, and that you are coming back. We thank you for the sacrifice that you made, for the immense privilege of this, and pray that you will work through us to share the image of who you are, not the God that the Christian church, that most of the Christian church preaches, but the truth of who you are as a loving and caring God, and that salvation is free and open to everybody, and that you would have that everyone be saved. Just please be with us now as we go from this place. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.